The sound of music and laughter can be drowned out by silence, more terrifying than any scream. Renaissance Rome, the year 1502. Inside the gilded chambers of the Vatican, a wedding feast swelled with opulence. Roasted peacock gleamed with gold leaf, goblets brimmed with spiced wine, and the air itself carried the heavy perfume of rosewater and power. This was not merely a wedding. It was a performance, a transaction, and before dawn it would birth a spectacle so grotesque that history would remember it in whispers. That night the ceremony of flesh would be repeated, not once but 3 times while they all watched. The title history has given this dark page as simple. 3 times that night while they all watched. At the center of this performance stood a bride draped in silks. Only 22, yet already a veteran of survival in the brutal theater of Renaissance politics. She was the daughter of Pope Alexander V, 6th, head of Christendom and the most infamous pontiff of his age, and the sister of Cesabura, whose ruthless ambition drenched Italy in blood. The name Borgia carried with it more than wealth and privilege. It carried poison, scandal, and fear. Allies were bought, rivals were murdered, and family was used like currency. For Lucizia, marriage was never about love. It was about strategy. And tonight, her body itself would be transformed into a ledger. Her intimacy into proof. Her humiliation into political collateral. The Vatican halls swelled with nobles, envoys, and cardinals, each one calculating what this union meant for their own survival. Her groom, Alonso d'Este, heir to the ancient duchy of Ferrara, sat at her side. His family was old, proud, and suspicious of the Borgias. For generations, the d'Este had ruled with the dignity of a dynasty rooted in tradition, while the Borgias were seen as dangerous newcomers. A Spanish family that had clawed its way to papal power through corruption and scandal. The Este family did not trust their new alliance. They needed more than ceremony, more than vows. They demanded certainty, and certainty in this world meant consummation. It was not enough that the wedding had been performed under gilded arches. Not enough that alliances had been signed in ink and sealed with papal authority. Alonso's family feared whispers, rumors that might later question his potency or Lucizia's fertility. They remembered her past marriages, each one ending in disgrace or blood. Her first husband, Giovanni Schwarzer, had been cast aside under the most humiliating charge of all, impotence. A fabricated claim, likely engineered by her family to free her for another alliance, but one that left her name forever tied to scandal. Her second husband, Alonso of Aragon, a man she reportedly loved, had been murdered on the Vatican steps, stabbed and strangled in a killing widely attributed to Caesarea himself. These ghosts still clung to Lucrezia as she entered this new marriage. The Este family was determined not to become another casualty of Buria politics. So they made a demand that stripped away any pretense of romance or dignity. The marriage bed must not only be consummated, it must be witnessed. When the feast ended, when poets had exhausted their verses and dancers had twirled their last steps, the couple was led not to a private chamber but to a stage. Curtains were drawn aside just enough for chosen witnesses, papal clerics, Este envoys, and notaries, and to peer in. These men stood in solemn silence, their faces half averted, but their eyes sharp, recording every motion, every breath, every proof of potency and fertility. In the flickering candlelight, the bride was reduced to her most basic function, a living guarantee. The air must have been unbearable. Imagine the hush of the chamber broken only by the crackle of torches, the rustle of fabric, and the forced intimacy of 2 young people turned into actors in a grotesque play. Alonso, heir of Ferrara, would have felt his pride shackled by the need to prove himself before strangers. Lucrezia, who had already endured 2 marriages stripped from her by annulment and murder, must have felt her very soul branded as property, reduced to flesh and proof. Every movement was a contract, every gasp notarized, every detail remembered. But here's the part that history seldom dares to whisper. It did not happen once. It happened 3 times. The first act was to erase doubt. The second to silence whispers. The third to seal the alliance beyond all challenge. Each time the witnesses stood firm, eyes gleaming like cold steel, their pens and tongues ready to testify to what they saw. 3 times that night, while they all watched. Her bride's body was turned into evidence, her privacy carved open, and her humanity stripped for politics. What does it mean for a woman to be used so mercilessly? What does it mean for a family to turn their daughter into a spectacle of humiliation? Renaissance Italy was not an age of romance or courtly honor. It was a viper's nest of shifting alliances where city-states like Venice, Milan, and Naples schemed for dominance, and where the papacy itself, supposedly the shepherd of souls, became the most ruthless player of them all. Pope Alexander Vic wielded his children as pawns, marrying and discarding them as alliances, rose and fell. Cesare Borgia, Lucicia's brother, carved a bloody path across Italy. His cruelty legendary, his ambition unchecked. For them, Lucretia was not a daughter or a sister. She was currency. But humiliation can burn into something more. Did she weep that night? Did her eyes blur with shame as the witnesses leaned forward to record her every movement? Or did she already understand the lesson her family had taught her since birth? That in this world even degradation can be turned into a weapon. The whispers began almost immediately. The Estavois carried the tale back to Ferrara. Nobles in Venice and Florence repeated the story over wine. Clerics in Rome muttered about the theater of flesh staged under the Vatican's blessing. What was meant as proof became gossip, and what was meant as humiliation became legend. Everyone knew now. Alonso d'Este was potent, Lucrezia, fertile. There could be no annulment, no whispers of impotence, no chance of undoing this bond. The alliance was sealed in flesh. The micro scenes of that night are haunting. A notary adjusting his quill as he squinted through the candlelight, a cleric clutching his rosary, murmuring silent prayers while his eyes betrayed his piety, an EST envoy shifting uncomfortably, caught between duty and revulsion, and beyond them all, Lucizia, the bride whose life had been negotiated more times than she could count, lying beneath the gaze of men who saw her not as a woman but as proof, a body transformed into contract ink. Yet this is where history twists. That same night, in the very act of being humiliated, the creature gained something no one expected: power. For once, the evidence could not be turned against her. She had fulfilled her duty in the most undeniable way. No rumors could unmake this marriage. No lies could erase the witness's testimony. The grotesque ceremony that had stripped her dignity also armed her with legitimacy. And in Ferrara, legitimacy was survival. This was the paradox of Renaissance Italy. The same world that weaponized shame could also forge power out of it. What was meant to cage her became the foundation of her throne. What was meant to humiliate her became the armor she would wield in the years to come. The first night in Ferrara was not merely a wedding consummation. It was political theater staged with flesh, a grotesque contract signed under candlelight. And in this theater, Lucrezia Borgia was learning the most brutal lesson of her life. After that first night in 1502, when Lucia Borgia's body was turned into proof, and her dignity into a stage play, whispers of 3 times that night flooded Italy. But what seemed at first like her ultimate degradation would become the crucible in which she was from porn to duchess, from scandal to survival. Lucretia transformed the theater of her humiliation into the theater of her authority. In Ferrara, the memory of that grotesque consummation followed her like a shadow. The Este family, old and proud, had gotten what they demanded: certainty. Their heir had proven himself potent and Lucizia fertile. No annulment could strip the marriage away. No rumors of impotence could poison the bond. Yet, while Ferrara's nobles sneered at the woman they believed was a tainted Borgia, Lucretia quietly sharpened her most unexpected weapon, resilience. In the weeks after her arrival, the court's whispers grew cruel. Some women snickered behind fans, calling her the bride of the stage. Men drank and retold the tale of the 3 acts, adding embellishments as wine loosened their tongues. Even clerics who had witnessed the ordeal hinted at its details in carefully veiled gossip. For most women of her time, such infamy would have been a prison, but Lucretia understood something her enemies did not. Once shame had been dragged into the open, it could know. Sharpened her most unexpected weapon, resilience. In the weeks after her arrival, the court's whispers grew cruel. Some women snickered behind fans, calling her the bride of the stage. Men drank and retold the tale of the 3 acts, adding embellishments as wine loosened their tongues. Even clerics who had witnessed the ordeal hinted at its details in carefully veiled gossip. For most women of her time, such infamy would have been a prison. But Lucretia understood something her enemies did not. Once shame had been dragged into the open, it could know. She became not a victim of humiliation, but a woman who carried it with composure. And composure in politics was power. Ferrara's people, too, learned to see her differently. While the Estenels clung to suspicion, ordinary citizens began to notice the young duchess's devotion. She walked among them, distributing arms, attending religious festivals, and speaking with a gentleness that belied the Buria name. Mothers whispered that she smiled at their children. Priest murmured that she knelt in prayer longer than many of her peers. It was not long before she was no longer the Borgia bride, but Labana Duchessa, the good duchess. But this transformation was not built on charm alone. It was forged in the brutal lessons of her family's world. Lucretia knew the theater of politics as well as anyone. She had seen her brother Cesare use armies and assassinations to carve his path across Italy. She had seen her father, Papi Alexander Vises, wield marriage alliances like daggers, discarding men the moment they were no longer useful. She knew that survival depended not just on appearances, but on control of the script. So she built a new stage in Ferrara. Literature established salons, glittering gatherings where poets, philosophers, and scholars debated under her patronage. She filled halls with discussions of Plato, recitations of Ariosto, and the music of court composers. Here the whispers of scandal dissolved into the echoes of intellectual brilliance. Guests who came curious about the infamous bride left, speaking of her refinement, her intelligence, her generosity to the arts. Bit by bit, she replaced the memory of 3 humiliating nights with the image of a duchess who elevated Ferrara into a beacon of Renaissance culture. And culture in Renaissance Italy was more than beauty, it was power. Patronage could launder reputations, reshape legacies, and rewrite the narratives whispered across courts. Just as her father had bought loyalty with gold and her brother with terror, the creature bought hers with art, music, and grace. She turned the same eyes that once stared through curtains into witnesses of a new performance, one she controlled. Her political acumen grew sharper with each passing year. When Alonso was called away to war, it was Lucizia who governed Ferrara in his absence. She signed decrees, balanced budgets, and negotiated with envoys. Citizens who once doubted her whispered instead of her fairness. Nobles who sneered at her origins began to admit her skill. Even Alonso, who had once been pressured into proving his marriage 3 times under scrutiny, came to rely on her judgment. She was no longer merely his wife. She was his partner in rule. But perhaps her greatest power came from the very weapon used against her, her body. In a world where women's worth was tied to fertility, the creature's public consummation had erased doubt forever. She bore children, securing the Este lineage, and each birth strengthened her position. No one could question her legitimacy. No one could suggest an Her humiliation had sealed her throne. Did she ever forget the faces of those who watched her that night? Did she remember the notaries with their ink-stained hands? The clerics with their forced solemnity? the own voice shifting uncomfortably in candlelight? Perhaps she did. Perhaps she carried those memories as scars. Or perhaps she turned them into fuel, reminding herself with each decree she signed, each court she dazzled, each festival she hosted, that the eyes which once sought to shame her had become witnesses to her triumph. Still, history refuses to let the mystery rest. Scholars argue endlessly. Was Lucretia merely a survivor shaped by the cruelty of men? Or was she a calculating force who learned to turn every humiliation into leverage? Some claim her letters, carefully measured and cautious, reveal a woman always performing, always scripting her image. Others argue they reveal a woman trapped by circumstance, surviving, but never free. The truth perhaps lies in between. She was both victim and strategist, both pawn and player. Yet what cannot be denied is the transformation. The young woman who entered Ferrara under the weight of humiliation left behind a legacy of power. The court that mocked her learned to respect her. The people who whispered about scandal came to revert her as their good duchess, and the act that was meant to strip her dignity instead cemented her throne. But the haunting question lingers. Why did it have to happen 3 times? Was it paranoia? Was it cruelty? Or was it a twisted symbol of the world she lived in? A world where flesh itself was proof, where marriage was war disguised as love, and where a woman's body was a battlefield for alliances. The 3 repetitions were not merely excess. They were the embodiment of Renaissance politics, ruthless, humiliating, and inescapable. Centuries later, the echo of that night remains. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power has always demanded sacrifice, and often the sacrifice is the body of the powerless. Lucrezia's humiliation was not unique. Countless women across history have been bartered, displayed, and stripped of dignity for the sake of alliances. But her story is remembered because she did what so few could. She turned her humiliation into power. And that is why 3 times that night still chills us. Because it reminds us that power and humiliation are often 2 sides of the same coin. Because it forces us to ask how many lives, how many bodies, how many intimate shames have been turned into proof for the ambitions of others. And because in the flickering candlelight of that chamber, we see not just Renaissance Rome, but the shadow of a truth that still lingers today. The curtain may have closed on Lucretia Borgia's stage, but its echoes remain. History wanted her humiliated. Instead, she became untouchable. And perhaps that is the final irony of her story. The very act meant to destroy her gave her the unshakable armor of legitimacy. The bed that was meant to cage her became the foundation of her throne, and the eyes that once watched her in silence became unwillingly the witnesses of her power.